Great. Hi,
Okay.
everybody. I'm not sure where everyone's located. I'm presenting to you tonight from my home office with the screen turned away from the mess and just towards the window. And I'm on a Coast Salish, unceded and uh, historical or sort of ancestral Coast Salish territory here, what we typically call Vancouver. I'm in East Vancouver, and that is part of Tsleil-Waututh ancestral lands as well. Closest to Tsleil-Waututh, but is what we call is Coast Salish, which is Squamish and Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh. So thank you very much for inviting me. I understand, Natalie, I have about 20-ish minutes.
Yes, that's
And
correct.
great. Okay.
Yeah.
And as Natalie knows from our conversations at Emily Carr, I tend to kind of talk too much. And so if Natalie, if you ever need to say like that's time and holler into the microphone, just let me know if I'm going over.
Okay. I'm sure it'll be great. So,
Okay, great. Okay, so let's share here. Okay, so as Natalie mentioned, I'm what I call a design studies practitioner, which means I use a lot of design skills and processes and tools, sometimes service design tools, in knowledge production and in facilitating conversations. But I also, in my research, I also research a lot of unacknowledged and anonymous Canadian design. And in teaching, I teach kind of an interdisciplinary design history and design research methods and different kinds of design theories. So the conversations about design are kind of wild and all over the place. And in the midst of all of this, I have my research on Canadian design. And I've hit, in the last couple of years, I've hit a few spots where I have some dilemmas, where my research is quite messy, where I'm not sure what my next steps might be in terms of codifying and substantiating the research. So I thought I'd show you sort of where I'm at today, and we can talk about it a little bit more. Um, I've been researching and developing narratives about Canadian design probably for about 8 years or so. And as I said, I'm mainly interested in what I would call anonymous and unacknowledged works. There's a ton of design in Canada that we don't know who designed, when they designed it, or why they designed it. So we're building back a kind of a history that doesn't actually exist at the moment. And I've also noted throughout my research the ways in which I would say other academics, curators, researchers have tried to tell me that the work that I'm looking at is not design. It's material culture, it's anthropological kind of objects, they're artifacts, but they're not design. And so I spend a lot of time constructing arguments about why I think they are design. And one of the things, without getting too backing up too much into my own history of research, is that throughout all of this investigation, I've noticed that there are actual problematic preconditions in design history. So often when we study design history, especially in Canada, we're actually taking art history that just happens to focus its subject matter on design. It's not necessarily looking at design as design. And we don't take into account the sort of the conditions of designing and using design when we establish design histories. And this is preventing us from building out maybe or decolonizing or trying new narratives in design um, for a lot of different reasons. So I've established what I've called problematic preconditions in design history, which means it's hard to assert the importance in design history because these pre-existing conditions exist that are always kind of pushing back. So we often see design in a pristine state, the way we would find it at its point of purchase. And even though we know when we have favorite designs, when we have favorite objects at home, it doesn't stay pristine. We often talk about design and promote design as though it's been designed by a singular person, often guided by the commodification of the designer itself. We often fixate on what we think is a shared concept of originality, only we don't often actually come up with that shared definition very clearly or very succinctly. And we often just conflate this idea of originality with legal ownership. So because somebody has patented something or somebody has claimed ownership over an idea, we say we decide whether or not that is original. And then we don't often see in design history the depiction of design over time or in a flawed state. So we don't see the impact of design when we study design history. So we don't see what the ecological impact is, what the labor impact, what the cultural influence was. So these are all kind of problematics, right? When we start looking and trying to rebuild. And I use James Dyson as my the scapegoat for all of these in a classic kind of design history text, because we don't see, we see this one singular so-called genius, right, who has put together this vacuum. And in fact, it takes a whole factory. And at one point, I've also sort of developed this terminology and taxonomies um, about the difference between design studies, design histories, the kinds of terms we would use, and how the traditional art history terms are holding us back. And so to me, that is the difference between a private domain, things belonging to a singular person. So in art history, you usually have one piece of art and it resides in a location, in one sort of specific location. With design, that's not the case. Design belongs to many people. And sometimes the idea of design, because it belongs to so many, it becomes common, becomes part of public domain. So we have multiple versions, multiple users of design. Instead of calling something original, we might decide to recognize it or talk about why it's so compelling. Instead of hooking our design works to authors and authenticity, we might talk about how this design is constitutes a concept or an idea or a way of living or a cultural aspect of being Canadian, and so on. So I've tried to sort of move our terminologies in some of my recent research. And then I also have kind of called for design historians to look for points of inversion. And some of my students will know from taking research with me, Natalie, you might you might have some bad dreams about me like pushing out this text by Boker and Starr called Sorting Things Out, where they define aspects of an infrastructure. And they talk about finding infrastructural inversions. And these are like knowledge infrastructures, conceptual infrastructures. And they talk about recognizing the depths of interdependence of technical networks and standards on one hand, and real work of politics and knowledge production on the other. And so it's sort of when the politics and the knowledge production start to question the rest of the structure, we can start to find these points of inversion. And so I've some of my points of inversion as I've been researching and teaching include bringing up a weaving from one of the members of Bauhaus from the 1920s and mentioning she is an incredible designer. This does not take away from her talent and her impact on her own cultural history. But often in Canada, we uphold the Bauhaus as being this original modernist movement. and Annie Albers being one of these textile artists coming out of those shops, being kind of the quintessential type of designer who looks at the geometrics of her own work, the abstraction of shapes, and we uphold this as being this kind of wonderful example, when in fact we have on the west coast of Canada, we have the Coast Salish weaving and textile tradition that has predated Bauhaus, probably by thousands of years. In this case, in this example I'm showing you of the nobility blanket, it is 20 years older than Annie Albers' very original design for a jute rug. And so you see, we've got our own examples. We have our own precedents in Canada, but we have not yet called it design, or we have not yet said designers have something to learn from Coast Salish weaving, and yet we flock to ourselves. So this is this opportunity to invert, to retell the narrative. And I've also done quite a lot of work around the Eaton's mail order catalog, and that being my sort of point of entry around anonymous and unacknowledged design. And this might be work for the rest of my career, to be honest. There's so much work to be done around understanding this cultural impact of Eaton's, understanding the breadth and the depth of design work that they've gone to. This is a system that has not only included the concepts, the manufacturing, the building of factories to manufacture your own goods, using the design of distribution networks, the hiring of illustrators and designers to put together catalogs. Some of these catalogs are 700 pages. Not just one catalog a year, but usually one a season, plus some of these smaller pamphlets and specialized catalogs. And we've not yet studied this impact of how did it affect us in our day-to-day lives, in our everyday lives. And the other thing that we haven't quite understood about some of this Eaton's work is how did it uphold, amplify, repeat, or commit certain colonial acts, right? One thing I want to emphasize as I show you this work from Eaton's is to say that it is indeed colonial. It has a kind of a modernist conceptual, it upholds this modernist concept that it is bringing progress to places that require progress. It is dependent entirely on a railroad, which in Western Canada brought a lot of violence and a lot of despair to our First Nations people and to the Indigenous lands. And so I understand, I understand that this to be a very colonial group. But what we have not yet done is to study it, to position it, to understand it, and then to see where it has, in fact, basically written culture for us. And there's some things that we may not know. I've got a little red square here that says research in modern merchandise. And this was pretty, this is kind of a small little item about a very, very significant kind of thing. There's still massive amounts of missing information around the operations and functions of Eaton's Research Bureau. They actually had two locations of a research bureau, and these were research labs which they would do material research. So they would research new plastics, new synthetic materials, excuse me, new synthetic materials. They would do market research. They would go into other department stores and check prices. They would do a comparative analysis between one of their catalogs and and a competitor's catalog, and they would do it in quite a huge amount of detail. And these are research labs. The one in Toronto was set up in 1916, and then a second location was set up in Winnipeg in 1917. And so what we don't know about the level of design research is kind of like breathtaking to me. Like we are missing a substantial amount of understanding. Even if it is not called design, we see how it fits in to what we know are design practices today. And also in my research to date, I sought out different kinds of paradigms for design cultural histories. And so instead of aligning ourselves just with art histories, I thought about literature and and uh, kind of literary, different kinds of literary um, categories that would be better suited to create narratives around this design. So in this Eaton's catalog, I was thinking about concepts of folklore, where it upheld traditional beliefs and different kinds of traditions and stories about a community, whether they are true or not. There was no author. It was significant in these transmissions of everyday values. So those are all the kinds of qualities of folklore. In adaptations, we could look at items of design which look similar to maybe this Medalta cup looks really similar to English restaurant ware, but we can talk about it as design, talk about it as an adaptation. Understand that it is repetition with variation. Understand that recognition and remembrance are part of this pleasure and risk of experiencing an adaptation. So we can move away from this concept of what's original and make space for us to say, okay, here is a cup. It was created literally with clay and dirt dug out of a hill in Alberta. The glaze was made, the machines were made and designed to carve out this cup. The only thing that makes it similar is some formal qualities. So could we set that aside or put that on pause while we talk about this as a Canadian artifact and its contribution to that? The same with Andrew King. I won't spend too long. Andrew King was a really interesting early 20th century printer in southern Saskatchewan, not far from where I grew up, actually. And he carved all of his posters. He carved everything out of wood. He did wood carvings and he printed wood prints for all of his posters. He happened to live in a town where the Soo line, the train that originated in Chicago, would pass right through their town. And so all the circuses that would come up into Canada through Chicago would require posters and different kinds of promotional materials. And so Andrew King would do that for them. And he was known for having posters that apparently were so large, and some of his letter forms were so large that they could cover the sides of barns. So he claims to have carved out letter forms that were 7 feet tall. Now, we cannot find any photos anywhere of like an old barn that happens to have a circus poster of Andrew King's on the side. And that is sort of the holy grail for me. But again, we can see that he sometimes is trading illustrations with other printers, other designers. We don't always know, they're not always dated, so we don't know which one comes first. We tend to think one that has maybe a different level of printing or level of detail might have come first, but that's not always the case. And you can see that there is sort of like a trading of illustrations, a kind of a collaboration, a borrowing back and forth, but often it is, his work sort of mimics a contemporary design practice in many ways. And then I also, as I've mentioned, I'm looking at Eaton's catalog and trying to understand the governmentality of this design, those structures of power, and understanding how these specific items actually contribute to cultural power. And of course, we see that through this kind of mythic and actually in almost, well, in two out of the three examples here, very incorrect depictions of Indigenous people. Here in the middle, you've got Jacques Cartier landing at Gaspé Peninsula and being greeted by what looks to be Indigenous people from the plains, which is would be laughable if it weren't so seriously damaging, right? And again, we see how this notion of progress and Eaton's kind of pushing this idea that we've come a long way because we have all these planes and trains and factories in the distance. One of the most, and then, sorry, on the end here, our 1955 catalog is one of the most, what I've called the egregious examples of colonial power, which is the town of Etonia being named being named by CP Rail in honor of the Eaton's catalog. So completely displacing any kind of place-based names or understanding of the land. It is really just this kind of assumption from both Eaton's and CP Rail that nothing was there before they arrived, and they sort of act that way. So now all of these things I understand are problematic, and I'm tussling with all of those aspects as I attempt to decolonize design history, even before we write it. And one of the things I wanted to show you all is sometimes what archival research looks like in design. And this is it at the Archives of Ontario at the York University campus. They hold all of the Eaton's T. Eaton Company business funds. So I'm not looking through design archives, and I'll show you why or how it is I'm not. I'm looking at business archives, and you order them several weeks in advance, let them know what days you're going to be there, and then when you arrive, this is what it looks like. And so you order from these lists. It's hard to know what you're going to see. And often, a lot of the things that you are trying to look at are recorded on microfilm, and you won't be able to see an actual copy of things. And this is really sort of the ultimate problem with trying to construct design history from something like business archives, is just the very, very poor ways in which the work is recorded, documented. You can see the Christmas catalog, 1897, looks like a bad photocopy. It's crooked. I don't even understand the paper, the level of illustration, whether there was any color. The bottom right image, you can see the archivist didn't even unfold the paper before they took the image, a photo of the image. So we have this kind of folded up corner. We don't know, again, the color. We don't know the illustrator. We don't understand the level of illustration. We don't know the styles of the illustration. Again, we're not experiencing the design here. And this microfilm, this little film here, just sort of shows you how you have to breeze through it and then capture it on screen. And then I also found out that you can do an interlibrary transfer from Archives of Ontario. And so they sent me a bunch of microfilm to the Emily Carr Library last year at this time. And even though, sorry, on my this is misstated here. It's actually from 2023. But then this is what I was managing to capture from those films. And you sort of see, you get a little bit of detail, but again, it's not great. You know, just to be able to get a sense of what these catalogs look like, it's very difficult. And so in the midst of all of those boxes, this is sort of where I come to my dilemma. At the midst of all of these boxes, I had one folder that said something like correspondence from the furniture department. And I thought, well, maybe I'll get some names out of this correspondence. Maybe they'll talk about which manufacturers they ordered from or which workers. And as I say in the slide, up until this point, I wasn't even sure that Eaton's was interested in the design of their home goods, that they were up for that kind of conversation. And I opened it up and I found this kind of duotang folder that had this in it. Companies win awards for special designs. And again, not necessarily dated. I don't think I have the date for this one. I think it's the early 50s. And here it is, a list of winners, design winners, and different kinds of manufacturers of household furniture and appliances. So suddenly I'm hearing more about Canadian design than I ever have. And then they also had this folder, or this pamphlet, which was a story about the design center. So the brand new design center in the late 40s, early 50s that was kind of set up by the National Gallery of Canada. So this was in Ottawa, and it was from this one is from the early 50s. So you can see they're already talking about the 1953 Design Awards. And they are here to sort of promote what they're calling better design of Canadian products. Well, this is really interesting because I didn't know that we actually had a program at some point in Canada that pushed this out. I've often seen the odd, some documentation of the odd show at National Gallery of Canada in the 50s. It was always confusing because it was always called like design and industry. They're all like named the same. But I didn't realize that there was a real kind of constitutional effort to promote design and to kind of move into this high modernist period. And so I kept finding all of these articles. And I have to tell you, when you are researching archives, you really don't have time to sit down and spend time with this stuff. Your arms hurt because you just hold your phone above everything and just click and click and click and click and start taking as many photos. So for me I still need to read all of this. I need to go through all of this information, even though it's been 2 years of holding on to this so far. And they had 3 different versions of what was called the Design Index, which was the names of designers and the manufacturers of the items and the prices that each item sold. And so you can see it was all in black and white, but they had from several years here. And then they also had design awards. And so the Design Center was giving out different design awards for different kinds of item, everything from furniture to appliances to textiles. And again, we don't know who's designing these pamphlets, who's putting it all together, who's communicating this out. But here we go. Oh, I think I got 2 of those. Design awards. And then we also, I also came across this idea that, okay, 5 minutes left, sorry, that they already discussed what adaptations were. So I started to see these full circles. So here, the writer had said, we do have a space for adaptation, but it really means like a really well fabricated, a simple idea like bowls and bowls or cups or mugs. And I'm like, mugs, I am right on. Everything is sort of starting to fuse and come together. I finally got a different angle of working with ideas of adaptations. And then again, you still see sort of these are amazing photos of the design center. And I can't find anywhere online where I might see color versions of these, or where it's possible that the National Gallery, or sorry, the National Archives of Canada has them. But again, I'm only reading a list, and the list will say photos 3. There's no, I'll have to like book a flight, go to Ottawa, find, request for this and find out whether or not these images are the right ones or not. And then there's this other thing coming up again that I want to address, which is this complaint about Canadian designers not being original enough. Again, back to this question of originality. What does that mean? And in fact, this grumpy guy from the furniture office in Eaton's had said, they're all a bunch of designers are a bunch of plagiarists, although Russell Kahl has been coming up with the odd crackpot design ever since he can remember. So, it's a pretty harsh binary to have to work in. You're either a crackpot or you're a plagiarist in this guy's mind. Like, where does originality fit in with this? It seems like there is all sorts of room for American designers to talk about being I don't know, kind of just being enthusiastic and kind of claiming a pedigree coming out of European modernisms, but Canadians don't give ourselves the grace for that. So there's something else about building out in design studies. We need to address these conversations, right? And then we also have these early design Canadian art design articles too, which I'm not going to spend too much time showing you, but to say there was mostly one guy, Donald Buchanan, who was carrying a lot of heavy load to keep this conversation going and to talk about, this better design in Canada. And really, at the end of this, I sat back and I realized Canada has a good design movement. At the very same time as the Americans were experiencing their good design movement and showing their work at the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan. And so we're very sort of similar. Here we've got a typography, and they're talking about it being James Evans' Cree spelling book. And some of the traditions that are coming out of Canada, all of those are important. So here I am with about 30 seconds left to finally get to my point, finally show you my messy front end of my research to say, I've got volumes here, volumes of images, volumes of content, volumes of names, and I have to figure out how to sort through. How do I contend with all of this information without repeating and amplifying the colonialisms and the way that designers and curators 70 years ago were trying to feature this work? And it's not easy because my first instinct was to build out a timeline and to be able to say, well, how does this stuff all relate to each other over time? And then to realize when I do build out a timeline, it does not include any kind of time immemorial type of work. And so any kind of Indigenous work that work transcends timelines. That is literally from traditions that are time immemorial, and it will break this infrastructure. It's an inversion, right? I also tried for a brief moment to see, well, could I also deal with these terrible photo reproductions? And I don't know if you can tell on your tiny screen, but these images look like they were cut out with scissors. And so they're all kind of choppy. And I thought, well, maybe I could, at least repeat them in line drawings and show sort of an outline or silhouette and try and bring back information. And realizing partway through when I'm just simply drawing a square, what is this really all about? This is not adding knowledge to what I need to do. It's not helpful. I've been working with mind mapping and trying to concept map out, again, realizing that I am calling it a good design movement, of which it was, again, still has this very exclusive and unequitable way of looking at design, which is not the way that I want to be able to move forward. So I have finally started taking some of my own advice. I've started working with what Lisa Grocott has called figuring diagrams to say, perhaps this is the universe of good design. And in fact, perhaps it does actually repeat in the way that I have displayed this. Perhaps it does repeat and amplify modernisms. But if we can say why and where it repeats it, then we can find those points of inversion and start to do some other work. So this is sort of part of critical data visualization, where they say if you're able to identify the assemblage, you can critique it. This is back to that Canadian arts. We can invert the narratives in some of these. So for as many times as we may talk about someone like James Evans developing the Cree syllabics, we need to also bring up the fact that the Cree people themselves do not accept this narrative, and that they have their own narrative of one of their own elders developing these symbols. His name was Calling Badger. We also should be able to talk about the decolonial aesthesis, really, which is rejecting the traditional colonial regulation of taste and composition, and look at and try and set aside those standards of beauty, and think about what else we should be looking at, critiquing, and including in our own design narratives. So understanding different points of view, kind of a standpoint theory. Sorry, I think I have like 2 slides left here. Also, we have to keep looking in non-designerly spaces. I'm still, I haven't checked for a couple of months, but I'm still on Facebook, and I'm still a part of many different historic groups that share a lot of old photos. And really, the photo on the left is one of Andrew King's hand-carved numerals, and you can see it's about 4 feet high. We really don't have too many. I'm pretty sure this middle photo is using Andrew King's numerals, but we don't often get to see it in its own environment in other ways. And this is just an example here, this glimpse of a poster. This was from a Saskatchewan Historical Society that was just showing these old full color photos they had of different communities. And lo and behold, in the background, it looks to be a giant poster by Andrew King with one of his huge, it's definitely his colors, definitely those huge numbers belong to him. And the location and the place, he would have claimed that as being kind of his printing territory. And printers in those days were being very respectful of their, you know, of which regions they would serve. I'm also bringing it back into Eaton's catalog and starting to match up where we see some of these items featuring how these items were distributed through everyday life as well. And another important lesson is coming out of Elizabeth Sumida Human's and Nathan Martin's book, Indigenous Research Design. And in one of their chapters, a couple of Lakota scholars talk about the importance of decay. And so again, as an infrastructural inversion, bringing this in to be able to say, it's okay. Like, I'm looking at a decaying image, and there is, it is a rich and important lesson, as they mentioned. And it's part of not knowing, right? And it's part of this relational research praxis that we could possibly adopt and respect as a part of this process. Okay, so that's it. I'm sorry I kept you for so long. The only other thing I wanted to mention is the book that I have edited and was published this year, Designing Knowledge, is has a lot of other writers who talk about their work and what it means to constitute a design studies practice, and it might be of interest to you all. So there you are.